when it's realized, it brings feeling of immensity, feeling of joy, like almost like you lose the burden, the weight of your problems. And so it's like a weightlessness, almost like in a spaceship. Somebody's probably experienced for the first time the feeling of weightlessness. There are four beautiful statements characterizing non-duality and non-dualistic approach. The observer is the observed, the experiencer is the experienced, and the thinker is the soul. Let me paraphrase it a little bit. On the level of perception, I would say, observer is the observed. On the level of experience, experienced is the experiencer. And on the level of thinking is the thought is the thinker. On the level of perception, when we say observed is the observer, what does it mean? It means that there is no separation, that there is no separate entity who observe, and that whatever is observed is the observer. In other words, it conveys the feeling of the immediacy of perception. On the level of experience, the experienced is the experiencer means actually that immediacy of feeling, both on a level of physical experiencing and the level of emotional one. And finally, thought is the thinker, conveys the meaning of that there is no thinker as an entity separate from the thought. And perhaps it's more difficult, that one is more difficult than the other two. But if you're able to understand, first to understand, and then realize these three expressions practically, then the whole thing conveys the feeling of immediacy of being. And I strongly believe that this could be achieved, could be experienced by everyone. It may take some practice. It may take, for someone, it may take a few days. For some, it may take a few months or a few years. And that brings, when it's realized, it brings feeling of immensity, feeling of joy, like almost like you lose the burden, the weight of your problems. And so it's like a weightlessness, almost like in a spaceship. Somebody's probably experienced for the first time the feeling of weightlessness, when weight is lost, the same way is the burden, the weight of your problems, of conflicts are suddenly gone. Unfortunately, it doesn't stay for too long. It may be experienced for a few seconds, maybe a little bit longer. Why? I think because we have some unresolved psychological problems, depression, anxiety. And the last but not the least is the masochistic component. What's a masochistic component? I addressed this issue at some length in my presentation of dealing with self-sabotage, self-defeating tendencies, psychic masochism, using non-dualistic methods. Nobody addressed this issue more thoroughly and completely than Edmund Burglar, who's almost ignored, almost forgotten. Why? Because he actually maintained that structure, which you call psychic masochism, social masochism, psychological masochism, is all pervasive. It affects everyone to a smaller or to a larger degree. But if you are happen to be a psychotherapist, psychologist, or psychiatrist, and you don't recognize that structure in yourself, and you didn't really resolve it, how can you help somebody else? And that's why probably the reason why he is almost forgotten or ignored in the psychological community. Nevertheless, he maintained that masochism, structure of psychic masochism, psychological masochism, is that that when we change, when we make pleasure out of displeasure, but, and that's essential, the pleasure, the displeasure, suffering is conscious, but displeasure, but making pleasure of displeasure is unconscious. So we have, on a conscious level, we have depression, anxiety, feeling of despondency, pain. But on the conscious level, we enjoy it. We're getting pleasure out of it. And the question, of course, arises, if it's unconscious, how can we know that there is an unconscious pleasure out of displeasure? Of course, we can deduce, we can assume, seeing how often people repeat the same mistakes, how they suffer all the time. We can deduce it, yes, especially after Freud, who discovered and who proved that there is unconscious. But still, it's a deduction. It's not a direct experience, it looks like, unconscious pleasure out of suffering. I believe that there is a chance to directly see it, experience this unconscious masochistic component. When we, even for a short time, be able to non-dualistically approach this problem, see it, that we can discover that a very subtle, specific enjoyment on unconscious level. It may not be exactly the same pleasure, by the way, as a conscious pleasure, but nevertheless, it exists if we discover it. And when we discover it, it's something else than a deduction, than assumption. And of course, we're not going to fight with it. If you, as you know, if we try to get rid of it or suppress it, it brings another problem. But if we non-dualistic seeing, and then we use the Kabbalah principle that in every state, in every negative state, there are sparks of positive, beautiful sparks. If we're able to see it, open up and lift it up, then the whole structure changes itself. Then we'll be able to understand the answer to the question, what was the meaning of that masochistic suffering? We can resolve that issue. And then we could see that by addressing this issue, by seeing it, first non-dualistically and then in Kabbalah way, then we could see that our life became enriched. We added another dimension to our life. So we added another dimension, become multidimensional life. So the whole thing changed, became complete. And of course, if we didn't address that issue, then that masochistic component is really very detrimental. When it's not addressed, when it's not changed holistically, then it can destroy our lives. It jeopardizes every endeavor. So we continue addressing this issue in our future videos because it's very important, both psychologically and spiritually.